One of the important points here is that we often think that diseases just come at us from somewhere, from outside of human society. But many diseases arise in tandem with things that humans are doing, things that we do as human beings, which can encourage the rise of certain diseases. Many of the diseases that we see come about or are associated with the rise of agriculture and urban settlements. In a lot of the hunter and gatherer eras, people were pretty spread out, so you didn't have as much disease transmission. And you also didn't have domesticated animals and people living close to their domesticated animals, which is where we get a lot of disease transmission. You also didn't have irrigation and the clearing of land for agriculture, and so things like malaria were not a big deal if you're not don't have irrigation systems. So if we look here, obviously there are things that happened in the olden days. You have tapeworm for the big game collaborative hunting. Then when you have permanent settlements, you get these things like giardia, roundworm, and hookworm. And when you have the domestication of animals, then you get some other nice things like rabies, brucellosis, and anthrax. And with the clearing of agriculture land, you get malaria and all those wonderful things. When people start to concentrate their crops on one particular thing and become dependent on that one crop, it can lead to other problems. For one thing, if your crop fails, it can lead to in times of starvation. Most of the great famines and great starvations have occurred under systems of agriculture, not under systems of hunting and gathering. So a lot of the things that we see in today's world are in part rooted in our experiments with agriculture. I'd also like to say that some of the monocropping and the problems that come from malnutrition, like pellagra, are not so much in the areas of the world where those crops were domesticated, but when people started to move crops from one part of the world to another, and they didn't include them in a total system of agriculture and domestication. So let me give you a couple examples. One of them would be corn. So maize was domesticated in what is now Mexico. If you go to Mexico today, there are hundreds of varieties of corn or maize. They eat them in various ways and they eat them with beans. And it provides a nutritious diet if it is grown correctly and eaten with other things. The issue is that when you take corn out of that context and start to grow it for all kinds of other things and don't combine it with those beans and other things that it was domesticated with, it can lead to problems like malnutrition. So, for example, in the area where some of my ancestors come from in northern Italy, they started growing and eating so much corn because it was so cheap and it was easier to grow and they didn't eat it with the right stuff. Pretty soon, even though they had enough calories, they were actually becoming malnourished or they didn't have the vitamins that they needed in order to support a healthy immune system. So this can happen when we take crops from one area of the world and don't know how to use them or combine them with different things. If you go into our world today, we grow a ton of corn and we turn it into all kinds of things. We turn it into corn syrup. We feed it to almost all of our domesticated animals. We've even figured out ways in which we can genetically engineer salmon so they can eat corn. We feed corn to our fish. We become very dependent on things like corn. It may not be the best idea because in its place of original domestication, there were multiple varieties and they used it combined with other things. Same thing with potatoes. If you go to the Andes today, there's hundreds of varieties of potatoes where it was domesticated, and you eat it with all kinds of other things. And it's yummy, and you don't just grow one variety of potato and make it into French fries all the time. You do different things with it. So, traditional agricultural systems are not necessarily a bad thing. They may introduce more diseases than some of the hunting and gathering systems, but we really see the effect when people start to monocrop them in today's or in the last 500 years or so. The next phase, we've been talking about things that happen. The disease is not simply something that happens to us from outside. A lot of it has to do with human modifications to the environment and our social practices. They mentioned the first epidemiological transition, which occurs about 5,000 years ago. And that's when you combine these agricultural inputs with some of the first urbanizations, dense settlements of people. We looked at pictures of some of those where you have people all packed together. You don't have good sanitation systems, and diseases start to spread. And that's where we get some of our deadliest diseases, diseases that are still with us today. Flu, measles, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is still the number one infectious disease, the number one killer of infectious diseases worldwide. Most of these diseases were transmitted to us from domesticated animals or close association with domesticated animals. A lot of these diseases were present in Eurasia, like smallpox and various plagues that swept across either from Asia to Europe or Europe to Asia and killed lots and lots of people. The Black Plague, various versions of flu, smallpox, all of these things. Now, the people in Eurasia learned how to deal with some of these things. A lot of people died, but they also learned what to do when smallpox comes to town. If you see smallpox coming along and people are dying of smallpox in the next village, what you need to do is shut your whole village down, burn the bridges, make sure everybody's separated from each other. If somebody gets it in their town, you throw that person out of town and you burn down their house just to make sure you don't get smallpox and it doesn't spread in your city. So the Europeans had become accustomed to dealing with smallpox because it's a very deadly disease and trying to figure out they developed some immunities to it. When the Europeans come to the Americas, where there were very few domesticated animals, not very many at all, and they were not important for agriculture. Didn't have horses, for example. The Europeans brought domesticated animals, and they brought these diseases with them too. For the most part, these diseases they were devastating for Europeans too, don't get me wrong, but they were more devastating for the indigenous American populations who had not developed resistances to them and had also not learned what you do when smallpox comes to town. Indigenous Native Americans were taught that you should care for the sick and watch them very closely. They weren't into isolation and burning down people's houses. This caused a lot of demographic issues in the Americas. Something like 90% of the indigenous population would eventually perish, not all because of the diseases. Some of them were killed and some of them were worked to death, but that's what happens or happened. There were very few diseases that were transmitted in the other direction. Some people believe that syphilis came from the Americas and was an indigenous to the Americas disease, but there's debate about even that. We see the spread of these very dangerous diseases. They're also very dangerous during childhood. A lot of them are childhood killers. A lot of the reason why we have longer life expectancies now is not necessarily because of our ability to keep people healthy in old age, but because that we have been able to vaccinate and have better hygiene for practices of people when they are younger than 2 years of age. A lot of these diseases would hit people during childhood. If a person dies before they are 1 year old and another person lives until they are 70 years old, your life expectancy is 35. However, if you can keep that other person alive for longer, then your life expectancy goes up, even though you haven't necessarily extended the life expectancy at old age. So a lot of people get confused when they see the life expectancies going up and they think we're making things better for old people. Yes, to a certain extent, but a lot of that had to do with the suppression of diseases that were the big killers of tiny, tiny people, tiny children. Measles, we have a vaccine for that. Vaccination for typhoid and for smallpox and for these things. One of the issues in our world today, you may have heard of it, is that people are not taking these vaccines as much as they used to. We have some interesting politicians who say that we don't need to do these vaccines anymore. We're now seeing that measles has made a comeback. Yay, measles. We also have things that are related to pollution, industrialization, so lead poisoning. Those of us who grew up in the 1970s and had leaded gasoline, and when they had lead in all kinds of other things, including plates and dinnerware. It's hard to say exactly what causes and has caused many of the cancers that we see. Some of them may just be related to the fact that people live longer in general, but some of them seem to be related to industrial production, various chemicals that we use and things that we use to clean things and produce things. Again, most of these diseases that we see are related to the rise of agriculture and domesticated animals. There have been some new ones in today's world. So one of them, these are related to human-induced climate change. So HIV, for example, is probably a result of clearing forests in order to they would become closer to some of the wild animal populations that were living in those forests. And that seems to have resulted in the jumping of HIV from a wild animal strain to another. It seems like, or most scientists, I believe that the same thing happened with COVID-19, that the transmission route was because of environmental issues, that clearing forests and contact between wild animals and humans, or certain domesticated animals and humans. And most of our diseases make this jump from one to the other. We can expect to see are more diseases that come from climate change. As forests are changed, as wild animal populations have to move into different areas, we may expect to see similar jumps. We saw before there was COVID, there was the Ebola, SARS. COVID has become an endemic disease. It'll just be with us from now on. There are also the diseases of what they call the global labor markets and neoliberalism. Things that people didn't used to have as much, but because we're so stressed out all the time and everybody's making you do things, work all the time, and transmit yourself in different ways to different places. Depression, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension, things that come from or are influenced by our stress levels and diets and the way that we live today. Again, it's not that these things were absent from traditional or societies of hundreds of years ago. It's simply that in today's world, we intensify some of these things. Your textbook talks about the ways in which some terms that most people would use as synonyms, we have to distinguish within anthropology and what is called medical anthropology. On page 440. So, Disease is clinical stuff, the stuff that can be diagnosed, the things like bacteria and viruses. We might refer to these as sort of biological characteristics of disease. Illness is more like how you start to feel about that if you have a disease or something like that. So it's more of a subjective thing. And some people might have greater symptoms biologically when they have a disease. Some of this is socially influenced, and how much social support you have when you're going through a disease can matter. So illness refers more to the subjective characteristic of how that plays out in an individual's life. Sickness, by sickness, we refer more to social ideas that are going on around a disease. So what social support systems we might have or not have, what stigmas might be attached to people who have certain diseases over time. We mentioned the ideas about what you did if smallpox arrives. Similarly, with some of our social responses to when COVID arrived were to have isolation, masking, distancing, a lot of the things that people mock today. But given that it was a newly emergent disease, it is not far-fetched. Some people believe that those practices should have, people should continue those practices when they get things like flus so they don't spread them around so much. Again, debatable, but different societies have different ideas about how people should experience and go through these things, different expectations for them. You might think of this in similar ways to how we talked about sex and gender. So sex was the biological characteristics, differences, and gender are those social expectations. In this sense, disease is the biological stuff that we can measure and clinically diagnose, but things like sickness is more the ideas, the social ideas that we have around those issues. Your textbook mentions, and I just wanted to mention too, the idea of evolutionary medicine. We're finding out that a lot of what happens to us as human beings is not just because of our human cells. The human microbiome refers to all the interacting microorganisms that live in and on our bodies. So, for example, we would be unable to digest food if there weren't certain bacteria growing and living in our stomachs. A lot of people are now concerned about their gut microbiome and their gut health. Interestingly, there are more bacteria cells, more microorganisms growing in, on, and around our bodies than we have human cells. So as we walk around, we are a host for a lot of different bacterias and things. We are more social than we are an individual, you might say. So this is probably going to be important for treating various diseases. And it's also important to recognize that we couldn't live without some of these things, like the microorganisms living in our gut. Try to move to something less sad than disease. Moving on to healing. For as long as humans have been humans, and as long as humans have had disease, humans have also been interested in healing. This is a reconstruction of dental work that comes to us from 13,000 years ago about in what was then Italy, where they're doing a filling on this person's teeth. Humans have a high degree of social cooperation. We live in groups, we live close to each other, we live next to each other. Part of that helps us transmit diseases to each other, but it also means we are concerned about what is going on with each other. Humans, to varying degrees, have something that is called empathy. So we have sympathy. Sympathy refers to how you feel about another person. You might have sympathy toward the things that they are going through. But humans take that another step. We have the ability to think about what it might be like to be that person. So empathy refers to not just having sympathy for a person, but putting yourself in somebody else's position and wondering what it might be like, or empathizing with that person as a fellow human being. We also have, we hope we have, we're able to recognize diseases, to diagnose them, and to accumulate knowledge based on things that seem to work when we treat diseases. So, like I mentioned, it might be what you do when a particular disease starts to arrive in town, like smallpox. We maybe learned something from COVID, or maybe we learned the wrong lesson. So we can accumulate knowledge and we can recognize diseases and use them in order to try and create healing. I mentioned that humans experience pain differently and experience pain subjectively. They have an interesting experiment that was done with different groups in Fiji. Some of them were indigenous to Fiji, and some of them were Indo-Fijians, or from more outsiders, had come in more recently. And they talked about the differences that men and women had and what they would rank as higher amounts of pain. Interestingly, for the some of the indigenous Fijian women, they ranked the pain of giving childbirth not as high. And that was because that they were in some ways expecting it and preparing for it and saw it as perhaps a good ritual to go through. Whereas for other groups, that would be one of the most painful things or imagine that you could possibly experience. So the point of the matter here is that even something like pain can vary according to your culture within different communities, and it can be influenced by your ideas of age, whether you're what gender you are, and your position within society. There are lots of things that we think of as affecting everyone equally across the world, but if you go into different groups, they seem to handle these things differently on a social level. This also applies to how we communicate illness. For those of you who might be interested in health professions, the medical world, anthropology can be quite useful in helping to understand what people are saying when they communicate different illnesses. So your textbook gives the example of people in Haiti where they would talk about something going on in their head or their heart. The people who were the doctors in this case were generally handing out medicine for this, but what apparently they were trying to communicate was more of a social distress. They needed not drugs, but resources to help with that situation. So people communicate illness in various ways, and it's important if you're on one side of the communication or another to try and understand how people are talking about this and how that might be varied in a cultural context. On the other side of disease is, of course, health. Your textbook defines health as the relative absence of disease, illness, sickness, stigma, and suffering, which is true. We usually think of ourselves as healthy if we are not having disease or illness or sickness. But I would add here that there is also an element to health which is about having positive relationships with your other individuals and your families and social relationships in your life. Healing is not just about getting rid of pain. We just talked about how people are trying to communicate distress It's not simply that you're in pain and need a drug to kill the pain. It is also about restoring our positive connections to others. Many different healing systems outside of the one that we know concentrate on these kinds of social connections, concentrate on creating more positive conditions so that people can be happier with their lives. Even if they might be experiencing pain, it's not just trying to get rid of pain or get rid of illness, it's trying to rebalance your social life.